The woman in seat 12F looked perfectly ordinary. She wore comfortable jeans, a simple gray sweater, and white sneakers that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she carried a worn paperback novel and a travel pillow. Nothing about her suggested anything special. When the flight attendant came by with the beverage cart, she ordered a ginger ale with a polite smile, the same as dozens of other passengers. The attendant barely glanced at her before moving on to the next row. To everyone on Flight 2847 from Seattle to Boston, she was just another face in the crowd, another tired traveler hoping for an uneventful flight across the country. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. At least, that's what her driver's license said. The man in seat 12E had tried making conversation earlier, asking if she was traveling for business or pleasure. She'd answered vaguely, something about visiting family, and he'd nodded before launching into a detailed explanation of his job in software sales. She listened politely, asking appropriate questions, giving no indication that she'd ever done anything more exciting than work in an office. When he asked what she did for a living, she said she worked in logistics, which technically wasn't a lie. Moving fighter jets and coordinating strike packages was a form of logistics, just not the kind most people imagined. What none of them knew, what the flight attendant serving coffee and the businessman discussing quarterly reports couldn't possibly guess, was that the unremarkable woman in 12F held a military record that would make seasoned pilots shake their heads in disbelief. Her real call sign, the one whispered in fighter squadrons from Nevada to Japan, was solo. She'd earned it 15 years earlier during a mission over hostile territory, when her wingman was hit and forced to eject, leaving her to complete the strike package alone, evade enemy fighters, and make it home through a sandstorm that had grounded every other aircraft in the region. But that was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Sarah had become something of a legend in circles that didn't officially exist. She'd flown missions that never made it into any public record, landing damaged aircraft on carrier decks in impossible conditions, bringing home planes that should have fallen from the sky, completing objectives that required the kind of precision flying that separated good pilots from truly exceptional ones. She'd been a test pilot for 3 years, pushing experimental aircraft to their limits and beyond, learning to feel every vibration and whisper of air over the control surfaces. She'd landed planes with no hydraulics, no instruments, and once, memorably, with no landing gear on a foam-covered runway while engineers held their breath and watched. Her final mission before retirement had cemented her status as perhaps the finest solo aviator in modern military aviation. Deep behind enemy lines, separated from her squadron by electronic warfare that had knocked out all communication, she'd flown for 3 hours alone through hostile airspace, completed her objective, and returned through a route that took her between mountain peaks in conditions that would have terrified most pilots. When she finally landed, her commanding officer simply stared at her and said, "Solo, you're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest." She'd smiled and replied, "Why not both, sir?" But that was all behind her now. She'd retired 6 months earlier at the age of 42, with more flight hours and commendations than most pilots accumulated in entire careers. She'd turned down offers to become an instructor, to join private military contractors, to write books about her experiences. She wanted normal. She wanted to blend in. She wanted to be the woman in 12F with the ginger ale and the paperback novel, noticed by no one. The flight had been smooth for the first 2 hours. The captain had come on the intercom to announce they were cruising at 37,000 feet, making good time with favorable tailwinds. Sarah had been half dozing, her book forgotten in her lap, when she felt it. A subtle change in engine tone, a tiny variation in the vibration coming through the airframe. Her eyes opened. Most passengers wouldn't have noticed anything. The man beside her was still typing on his laptop. The mother across the aisle was reading to her young daughter, but Sarah's trained senses detected something wrong. She sat up straighter, listening intently. There it was again. A momentary fluctuation in the steady drone of the engines. Then the intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice came through, though there was something tight in his tone that Sarah recognized immediately. "Folks, this is Captain Richardson. We're experiencing a minor technical issue, nothing to be concerned about, but we're going to descend to a lower altitude as a precaution. Flight attendants, please return to your seats." Sarah's hands gripped the armrests. Minor technical issue was pilot speak for something more serious than they wanted passengers to know. The flight attendants moved quickly to their jump seats, their professional smiles not quite hiding their concern. Sarah felt the nose of the aircraft dip as they began descending. She glanced out the window, noting their position over the mountains of Montana, checking the wing surfaces for any visible problems. Then the intercom clicked again, but this time what came through wasn't words, it was a strange, strangled sound, followed by what might have been a gasp, then silence. The line stayed open for a few seconds with nothing but dead air before it cut off abruptly. Around her, passengers began exchanging worried glances. The mother pulled her daughter closer. The businessman stopped typing. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. A flight attendant near the front noticed immediately and called out, "Ma'am, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." "I need to speak with the captain," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that made the flight attendant pause. "That's not possible right now. Please sit down." Sarah was already moving forward, her entire demeanor changing from casual passenger to something else entirely. The flight attendant moved to intercept her, but Sarah simply said, "I'm a pilot, military. I need to check on the flight crew right now." The flight attendant's eyes widened, but before she could respond, another attendant emerged from the cockpit, her face pale. "Call for medical assistance," she said, her voice shaking. "Both pilots are unconscious. Something's wrong with them." The cabin erupted in frightened murmurs. Sarah pushed past the attendant and into the cockpit. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Captain Richardson was slumped forward against his harness, unconscious. The first officer leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, breathing but unresponsive. The cockpit smelled faintly of something chemical, something that shouldn't be there. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Carbon monoxide, some kind of fume event, but it didn't matter right now. What mattered was that this Boeing 737, carrying 173 passengers and crew, was currently flying itself on autopilot with no conscious pilots, and they were still descending. She glanced at the altimeter, 22,000 feet and dropping. The autopilot was following the last command it had been given. She reached for the radio. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 2847. We have a pilot emergency. Both flight crew are incapacitated. I am a passenger taking control of the aircraft." She waited for a response. Nothing. She tried again on different frequencies. Still nothing. Then she noticed the radio panel was showing error codes across multiple systems. Something had taken out their communication equipment. Sarah stood alone in that cockpit, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility she'd carried on so many missions. Except this time there was no ejection seat, no parachute. 173 people were depending entirely on her, and she had no way to communicate with the ground, no way to get guidance, no co-pilot to help with the workload. She was completely, utterly alone. She took a deep breath and slid into the captain's seat, adjusting it quickly. The 737 was a different beast from the fighters she'd flown, heavier and less responsive, but the principles were the same. She scanned the instruments, getting oriented. The autopilot was still engaged, which was good, that gave her time to think. They were at 19,000 feet now, still descending at 1,500 feet per minute. She needed to level off, assess the situation, and figure out where to land. Her hands moved across the panel with practiced efficiency, stopping the descent and leveling the aircraft at 15,000 feet. She noted their position on the navigation display, over central Montana, miles from any major airport. She pulled up the moving map, searching for options. Billings was too far, given their position and the fact that she had no idea how much time the pilots had before whatever affected them might affect her too. She needed somewhere closer. A flight attendant appeared at the cockpit door, her voice trembling. "What do we do? Should we tell the passengers?" Sarah kept her eyes on the instruments. "Tell them we have the situation under control. Have everyone remain seated with seatbelts fastened. And I need you to open all the air vents in the cabin, maximum flow. Whatever affected the pilots came through the air system. We need to flush it out. Are you sure you can fly this?" Sarah allowed herself the briefest smile. "Yeah, I can fly this." But it wasn't that simple. Flying was one thing. Landing a Boeing 737 without any assistance, without communication, without a co-pilot to help with the hundreds of tasks normally split between two experienced commercial pilots, was something else entirely. She'd landed plenty of aircraft solo, but they'd all been designed for single-pilot operations. The 737 had been built on the assumption that two trained professionals would be working together, dividing responsibilities, backing each other up. She'd have to be both pilots, flying the aircraft, navigating, configuring it for landing, running all the checklists, managing the engines, the flaps, the landing gear, the speed, the altitude, everything. All while making an approach to an airport she'd never landed at before, with no tower guidance, no weather information, and no way to coordinate with other traffic that might be in the area. Sarah's hands moved steadily across the controls. She'd been in impossible situations before. The key was to break it down, prioritize, and take it one step at a time. First priority: find a suitable airport. She studied the map display. There was a mid-sized airport 40 miles ahead, Great Falls International. Long runways, good enough for a 737. That was her target. She turned the aircraft toward Great Falls, her fingers finding the heading selector and rotating it smoothly. The 737 banked gently, settling onto the new course. She checked the fuel, plenty, no issues there. She checked the engines, running normally. She went through all the systems methodically, looking for anything else that might be damaged or malfunctioning. Everything seemed normal except the communication systems, which were completely dead. At 30 miles out, Sarah began her descent again, this time under her control. She throttled back the engines, feeling the aircraft respond. The autopilot was still engaged for now, helping her maintain precise altitude and heading, but she'd have to hand-fly the landing. There was no way around that. She needed to feel the aircraft, to sense what it was doing, to make the tiny corrections that would get them safely on the ground. She started running through the landing checklist in her mind. She'd need to configure the aircraft gradually, extending flaps in stages, getting the landing gear down at the right time, maintaining the correct speed at each phase. Normally the pilot flying would call for settings and the pilot monitoring would make them happen. She'd have to do both, moving her hands between the control yoke and the various switches and levers, never losing track of what the aircraft was doing. At 20 miles, she began configuring. She reached for the flap lever, extending them to position 1, feeling the aircraft slow slightly, and adjusted power to maintain her descent rate. Her right hand stayed on the throttles, her left on the yoke, her eyes scanning between the instruments and the windscreen, where she could now see the city of Great Falls ahead. At 15 miles, she disconnected the autopilot. The yoke came alive in her hands, and suddenly she was flying. The 737 responded differently than her fighters had, heavier, more ponderous, but she adjusted quickly, making small corrections, feeling the aircraft's momentum, learning its personality. Every plane flew a little differently, had its own quirks and characteristics. She had to learn this one fast. Flaps 5, she said aloud, the old habit of calling out actions coming back automatically, even though there was no co-pilot to acknowledge. She reached for the flap lever with her right hand while her left maintained control, extended them to the next position, felt the increased drag, and added power to compensate. At 10 miles, she could see the airport clearly, 2 runways in an X pattern. She'd take the longer one, runway 03, pointing northeast. The wind was light, coming from the northwest, so she'd have a slight crosswind, but nothing she couldn't handle. What concerned her more was the possibility of other traffic. Great Falls was a moderate-sized airport. There could be other aircraft in the pattern, on approach, or on the ground. She had no way to warn them, no way to coordinate. She'd have to keep her eyes open and hope. Gear down, she called out, her hand finding the landing gear lever and pulling it down. She felt the rumble as the massive wheels extended and locked into place. 3 green lights confirmed they were down and locked. Flaps 15. She extended them further, feeling the aircraft slow, needing more power now to maintain her approach speed. At 5 miles, she was at 2,000 feet, perfectly positioned on the glide path. Her hands made constant tiny corrections, adjusting for wind, speed, and altitude. She was in the zone now, that state where everything else fell away and there was only her and the aircraft, connected, moving together. This was what she'd always been good at, this pure connection between pilot and machine. Flaps 30, she said at 3 miles. The 737 slowed further, configured now almost completely for landing. She checked her speed. 145 knots, right where it should be. Altitude. 1,000 feet. The runway was ahead, a long strip of concrete growing larger. She could see hangars, terminal buildings, a few parked aircraft. And then she saw the other plane, a small Cessna just lifting off from runway 21, the crossing runway. It was climbing, turning, and would pass right through her approach path in about 30 seconds. Her heart rate didn't increase, she'd dealt with worse. She made a quick calculation and adjusted her descent rate slightly, steepening it just enough to pass under the Cessna's climb path with safe separation. Flaps full, she called at 500 feet, the final flap setting. The 737 was completely configured now, committed to landing. She made a small correction for a wind gust, keeping the nose perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. Her right hand hovered over the throttles, ready to add power if needed, ready to go around if anything went wrong. Though with no co-pilot and the complexity of reconfiguring the aircraft, a go-around would be far more dangerous than normal. At 200 feet, she began the flare, gently pulling back on the yoke, raising the nose slightly, beginning the transition from descent to landing attitude. The runway rose up to meet her. At 50 feet, she pulled the throttles to idle with her right hand while her left continued to ease back on the yoke, feeling for the ground. The main wheels touched down with barely a chirp, a perfect touchdown, right on the numbers. She let the nose wheel come down gently, then immediately deployed the speed brakes with her left hand while her right went back to the throttles, pulling them into reverse. The roar of the reversers filled the cockpit as the aircraft decelerated rapidly. Her feet worked the rudder pedals, keeping them tracking straight down the centerline. She pressed the brakes smoothly, feeling the massive aircraft slow. They rolled down the runway, speed bleeding off, until finally, 3,000 feet down the 10,000-foot runway, she brought them to a complete stop. She sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, and let out a long breath. Then she reached up and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was profound. Sarah sat in the captain's seat and allowed herself 5 seconds to feel the weight lift from her shoulders. Then she was moving again. She needed to get medical help for the pilots, evacuate the passengers safely, figure out what had happened. She stood and opened the cockpit door. The cabin erupted in applause. Passengers were crying. Some were praying. Others simply stared at her in disbelief. The flight attendant who had questioned her earlier was wiping tears from her eyes. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved everyone." Sarah shook her head. "Just doing what needed to be done. Now let's get medical help for the pilots and get everyone off safely." Emergency vehicles were already racing toward the aircraft, lights flashing. Someone on the ground had seen the landing and understood it was an emergency. Within minutes, paramedics were on board treating the pilots, and passengers were being evacuated down the emergency slides. What Sarah didn't know was that her landing hadn't gone completely unnoticed. When Flight 2847 had lost communication and ATC couldn't raise them, protocols had been initiated. 2 F-22 Raptors from Malmstrom Air Force Base, just 80 miles away, had been scrambled to intercept and assess the situation. They'd arrived just as Sarah began her final approach. Major Jake Hawk Morrison had watched from 30,000 feet as the 737 made its approach. "Tower, this is Raptor 11. I have visual on the target aircraft. Appears to be making an approach to Great Falls. No apparent distress signals. Copy that, Raptor 11. We have no communication with that aircraft. Their transponder shows an emergency code." Hawk watched through his targeting pod as the 737 descended, perfectly controlled, perfectly stable. Whoever was flying that thing knew what they were doing. He saw the landing gear extend, the flaps deploy in stages, the aircraft maintain a beautiful approach path. Then he saw the near miss with the Cessna, saw the Boeing adjust its descent just enough, saw it continue down. "Raptor 12, you seeing this?" He called to his wingman. "Copy. That's some impressive flying. Who's at the controls?" "Don't know. But they can fly." They watched as the 737 touched down, smooth as silk, rolled out, and stopped. "Tower, target aircraft has landed safely at Great Falls. Flight appears to be under control." "Copy, Raptor 11. Good eyes. Return to base. But Hawk's curiosity was piqued. When he landed back at Malmstrom, he made some calls. What he learned made him grab his wingman and head straight to the operations center. The duty officer looked up as they entered. The 2847 situation, Hawk said. Yeah, crazy story. Both pilots were incapacitated by some kind of fume event. A passenger landed the plane. What passenger? The duty officer checked his notes. Female passenger. Gave her name as Sarah Mitchell, said she was military. Took control of the aircraft. Can you run that name? Mitchell, Sarah. The duty officer typed into his terminal. Then his eyes widened. Holy, she's in the system. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired. Call sign. He looked up at Hawk. Her call sign is Solo. Hawk felt his stomach drop. Wait. The Solo. The Solo. According to this, yeah. 17 years active duty. Flew F-16s and F-18s, 3 combat tours, test pilot, instructor pilot. Jesus, her record is insane. Look at this mission list. Hawk leaned over to read the screen, and with each line his respect grew. He'd heard stories about Solo. Legends, really, tales that got passed around pilot bars about the aviator who could do impossible things. The landing in the sandstorm, the carrier landing with no hydraulics, the Solo penetration mission everyone said couldn't be done. He'd always thought they were exaggerated, that no one could really be that good. She landed a 737 by herself, his wingman breathed. No co-pilot, no comms. Apparently. Hawk shook his head slowly. And we just watched her do it. That approach was textbook perfect. The duty officer was still reading. Says here she retired 6 months ago. Turned down multiple offers to continue flying. Wanted to go civilian. He looked up. She was just a passenger. She was traveling home and this happened. Hawk picked up the secure phone and dialed the number for fighter operations at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, one of the main fighter training centers. When Colonel Sarah Viper Rodriguez answered, he said, Viper, it's Hawk at Malmstrom. I need to tell you something. What's up? Solo just landed a commercial airliner alone. Both pilots down, no comms. She saved 173 people. There was a long silence. Then Viper's voice came back, quiet and filled with something like awe. Solo did what? You heard me. Sarah Mitchell was a passenger on a 737. Pilots went down. She took over and landed it. Solo. We watched from up top. It was beautiful flying, Viper. Perfect. Another silence. Then Viper said softly, of course it was. It's Solo. Then, even quieter, that's why she's Solo. The story spread through military aviation channels like wildfire. By that evening, pilots at bases around the world were hearing about it. The reactions were all similar. Initial disbelief, followed by confirmation, followed by a kind of reverent respect that pilots reserve for only the most exceptional of their peers. At Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, a group of F-22 pilots were in the briefing room when someone pulled up the news footage on the big screen. It showed the 737 on the ground at Great Falls, emergency vehicles surrounding it, passengers evacuating. The news anchor was talking about the miracle landing by a mysterious passenger. One of the pilots, Captain Mike Frost Hansen, pulled up the military database on his tablet. Wait, let me check something. He typed quickly, then went very still. Guys, the passenger who landed that plane, her name is Sarah Mitchell. Her call sign is Solo. The room went silent. Every head turned to look at him. One of the senior pilots, a lieutenant colonel with 20 years in fighters, stood up slowly. Solo. As in, the Solo. The one and only. He walked to the window, staring out at the F-22s on the flight line. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone heard it. Solo saved 173 people today. Landed a Boeing 737 by herself. No help, no comms. He turned back to face the room. That's the kind of pilot she is. That's the kind of aviator we all hope to be. Another pilot, a young captain fresh from training, asked, is she really that good? I've heard the stories, but... The lieutenant colonel cut him off. The stories don't do her justice. I flew with Solo once, years ago, on a training exercise. I've never seen anyone command an aircraft like she did. It wasn't just flying. It was like the plane was part of her, like she could feel what it was thinking. He shook his head. The stories are real. All of them. At Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, the story reached a squadron of F-22 pilots who'd been on a training mission. When they landed and heard the news, their squadron commander, a colonel named Raymond Blade Wilson, called them together. Listen up. I need to tell you about a pilot. Her call sign is Solo. Today she did something that most of us couldn't do, even with a full crew in perfect conditions. She landed a commercial airliner by herself after both pilots were incapacitated. No assistance, no communication, just her skills and her nerve. He paused, looking at each of them. Solo is why we train. She's why we push ourselves. She represents the absolute pinnacle of what a pilot can be. And today, as a civilian, just a passenger, she proved it again. When I fly, when I practice emergency procedures, when I work on perfecting my craft, I think about pilots like Solo, because that's the standard. That's what exceptional looks like. One of his pilots raised a hand. Sir, did you ever fly with her? Blade smiled. Once, 5 years ago. She was evaluating a new weapon system I was flying chase on. She did things with that aircraft that the engineers said were impossible, and she did them smoothly, like it was easy. He looked around the room again. She's retired now, wanted a normal life. But today, when people needed her, she stepped up, and she didn't just save them. She gave them a perfect landing, because that's what Solo does. The story continued to spread. By the next day it had reached international fighter squadrons, RAF pilots at Lakenheath in England, French Rafale pilots at St. Dizier, Japanese F-15 pilots at Komatsu, German Eurofighter pilots at Norvennik. All of them heard about Solo and the commercial airliner, and all of them reacted the same way, with quiet, profound respect. Sarah Mitchell didn't know about any of this. She was sitting in a hotel room in Great Falls, trying to process what had happened. The FAA was investigating. The airline was grateful. The passengers were calling her a hero. She just felt tired. When her phone rang and it was Colonel Rodriguez, her old squadron commander, she almost didn't answer. Solo. Viper's voice said warmly. You okay? Yeah, just tired. I heard what you did. The whole community heard. Sarah sighed. I just landed a plane, Viper. It's what we're trained for. Don't diminish it. You landed a Boeing 737 Solo. No co-pilot, no comms. That's not just training. That's art. That's mastery. I did what anyone would have done. No, Viper said firmly. You did what only Solo could do. And every fighter pilot in the Air Force knows it. They're talking about you, Sarah. The F-22 guys who were on station watching you, they're in awe. I've gotten calls from 3 different bases. Do you know what they're saying? What? They're saying your call sign in whispers, like it's sacred. Because to them, it is. You represent something we all aspire to. And today you proved why that call sign means what it means. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes. I just wanted to be normal. You can never be normal, Solo. You're extraordinary, and that's okay. Today you saved 173 people because you're extraordinary. Embrace it. After she hung up, Sarah sat in the dark hotel room and thought about what Viper had said. She'd spent her whole career trying to be the best, pushing herself, taking impossible missions, earning that call sign through countless solo operations where everything depended on her alone. And now, even in retirement, even trying to be anonymous, that same calling had found her again. 3 days later, back at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Hawk was flying a routine patrol when his radio crackled. Raptor 11, this is Raptor 27. Just wanted to say something. Go ahead, 27. There was a pause, then a voice he didn't recognize, young and respectful, almost reverent. Solo landed that plane. I heard it was Solo. Hawk felt a smile cross his face. Confirmed, 27. It was her. Another pause. Then, so quietly it was almost lost in the static, Solo. The way the young pilot said it, like a prayer, like an invocation, carried the weight of every impossible thing she'd done, every life she'd saved, every mission she'd completed when everyone else said it couldn't be done. Over the following weeks, it became a tradition. Fighter pilots, when they heard her story, would say her call sign once, quietly, with that same reverence, not loud, not as a cheer, but as a recognition of mastery, of excellence, of a pilot who represented the absolute peak of their profession. In ready rooms and cockpits, in briefing rooms and pilot bars, the story was told and retold. The female passenger who'd seemed so ordinary, who'd been overlooked by everyone, who'd been just another face in the crowd, until the moment came when lives hung in the balance, when the impossible was required, when someone had to fly an aircraft alone and save everyone aboard. And she'd done it. Not just done it, but done it perfectly. In bases around the world, in the cockpits of the most advanced fighters ever built, pilots who pushed themselves to be the best, who trained for impossible scenarios, who lived for the moment when their skills would be tested, heard the story and whispered her call sign with an understanding that transcended words. Because Solo didn't just land a plane that day, she reminded everyone what excellence looked like. She showed what a single pilot with mastery of their craft could accomplish. She proved that all those hours of training, all that dedication to perfection, all that commitment to being ready for anything, mattered. When the moment came and people needed her, she was ready. The F-22 pilots whispered her name because they understood what it meant. They flew the most advanced fighter in the world, aircraft that required incredible skill to operate. They were the elite of the elite, and they recognized in Solo someone who operated at a level even beyond their own. Someone who'd achieved a mastery so complete that she could take an unfamiliar aircraft into an impossible situation and make it look easy. Sarah Mitchell eventually went back to her quiet life. She declined all interview requests, turned down the award ceremonies, avoided the spotlight. She'd never done it for glory. She'd done it because people needed help, and she could help them. That was enough. But in the fighter-pilot community, her legend grew. New pilots coming up through training would eventually hear the story about Solo, about the commercial airliner, about the perfect Solo landing, and they'd understand that somewhere out there was a pilot who represented the absolute standard, the peak of what was possible. And knowing that she existed, that someone had reached that level, inspired them to push harder, train better, reach higher. Years later, a young F-22 pilot named Lieutenant Sarah Chen would be on patrol when she heard her instructor, a veteran with 15 years of fighter experience, say quietly over the radio, "If you ever wonder how good a pilot can be, remember Solo. Remember the commercial airliner she landed alone. That's the standard. That's what we reach for." And Lieutenant Chen would key her mic and reply, her voice filled with the same quiet reverence, "Solo." The word would hang in the air for a moment, carried over military radio frequencies, spoken in hushed respect by those who understood what it meant. Not just a call sign, not just a name, but a symbol of mastery, of excellence, of a pilot who could do the impossible alone. Because that's what Solo meant. When everyone else needed help, she flew alone. When the situation was impossible, she made it possible. When lives depended on perfection, she delivered perfection. And fighter pilots around the world, the best of the best, the elite aviators who commanded the skies in the most advanced aircraft ever created, would hear her name and whisper it like a benediction, like an aspiration, like a reminder of what they were all trying to become. Solo, the woman who landed the plane alone, the legend who saved 173 lives through mastery of her craft, the pilot whose call sign would be whispered in reverence for generations to come.